Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that's going to shatter everything you think you know about ancient Egypt. We're exploring why being a pharaoh meant living every day knowing your family could kill you, your food could poison you, and your gods could abandon you. Because the truth is, those golden tombs weren't just burial chambers, they were escape plans. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The morning sun crested over the Nile, casting long shadows across the palace complex at Memphis. Within the royal nursery, a child no more than 7 years old sat rigid on a miniature throne, his small hands gripping the armrests as scribes recited the endless list of divine duties he would inherit. This boy would one day be called Pharaoh, ruler of Egypt, God among men. But what the scribes didn't tell him was that he had just been sentenced to a lifetime of magnificent terror. The reality of pharaonic life bore no resemblance to the golden fantasies carved into temple walls. While common Egyptians saw their ruler as a living deity, blessed by the gods and surrounded by unimaginable wealth, the truth was far more sinister. From the moment a royal child drew breath, they entered a world where survival meant mastering the art of paranoia, where every meal could be poisoned, every smile could hide a dagger, and every family member was a potential assassin. The education of a future pharaoh began before they could properly walk. Royal tutors, themselves survivors of court intrigue, taught lessons that went far beyond hieroglyphics and mathematics. Young princes learned to sleep lightly, to taste their food carefully, and to trust no one completely. Not even their mothers. The palace was not a home. It was a training ground for the most dangerous job in the ancient world. Royal children were isolated from the outside world, surrounded by a carefully selected group of servants, tutors, and guards, whose loyalty was bought with gold and maintained through fear. They lived in chambers that were part nursery, part fortress. The walls were decorated with scenes of divine kingship, but the windows were barred and the doors were guarded by men who served multiple masters. Even at play, royal children were watched, their games monitored for signs of weakness or rebellion that might be exploited later. The curriculum was unlike any other education in the ancient world. Royal princes studied not just the traditional arts of reading, writing, and mathematics, but also poison detection, the interpretation of facial expressions, and the subtle art of reading loyalty in a man's eyes. They learned to recognize the 23 most common assassination methods, to identify the symptoms of the 14 deadliest toxins, and to sleep with one eye open. By age 10, most royal children could detect a lie faster than a priest could recite a prayer. Physical training was equally intense and paranoid. Young pharaohs learned swordplay, not for glory in battle, but for the moment when their own guards might turn against them. They practiced archery not for hunting but for the day they might need to eliminate a threat from a distance. They studied wrestling not for sport but for close quarters combat in their own bedchambers. Every lesson was taught with the understanding that enemies could come from anywhere, including the breakfast table. The psychological pressure began early and never relented. Royal children were constantly reminded of their divine status, while simultaneously being warned of its dangers. They were told they were chosen by the gods, blessed above all mortals, destined for greatness. In the same breath, they were informed that this blessing made them targets, that their divine blood was coveted by those who would spill it for power. The contradiction was maddening. You are a god, but you must hide like a mortal. You are all-powerful, but you are constantly in danger. Family relationships were poisoned from the start. Royal siblings were not playmates, but competitors in a deadly game where second place meant exile or death. Brothers were taught to view each other as threats to the throne, while sisters were trained to be political assets or potential traitors. Even maternal love was suspect, as royal mothers often had sons by different fathers, each pushing their own child's claim to power. The palace was filled with half-siblings, stepmothers, and distant cousins, all plotting, all watching, all waiting for an opportunity. The royal court itself was a maze of protocol designed as much for protection as for ceremony. Every aspect of a young pharaoh's day was regulated, from the order in which they dressed to the specific words they used in conversation. This wasn't mere tradition, it was a security system. Deviation from protocol could signal an imposter or indicate that the pharaoh was under duress. The elaborate ceremonies that awed foreign visitors were actually coded communication systems, ways for the pharaoh to signal safety, danger, or the need for help without alerting potential assassins. Even the royal diet was a source of constant anxiety. Young pharaohs learned to eat only from specific dishes, prepared by trusted cooks and tasted by designated servants who would die if the food was poisoned. They discovered that certain combinations of foods could be harmless separately, but deadly together. That some poisons took days to work, and that even trusted servants could be turned by promises of gold or threats to their families. Meal times became elaborate rituals of survival, not nourishment. The religious aspects of pharaonic training were perhaps the most psychologically damaging. Young rulers were taught that they were living gods, incarnations of Horus, with direct communication to the divine realm. But they were also informed that the gods were fickle, that divine favor could be withdrawn at any moment, and that religious failure could result in cosmic disaster. The pressure to maintain perfect spiritual performance, to never show doubt or fear in religious ceremonies, to embody divinity while feeling utterly human, created a psychological burden that would crush most mortals. The daily routine of a royal child was meticulously planned and heavily guarded. Dawn brought the ritual of awakening, where servants would enter the royal chamber in a specific order, each carrying designated items, each speaking prescribed words. The young pharaoh would be bathed in water that had been blessed, tested, and guarded overnight. The clothing was inspected for hidden weapons or poisoned fabric. Even the jewelry was examined for sharp edges or toxic metals that could cause harm through prolonged contact with skin. Breakfast was a theatrical performance of survival. The royal kitchen was a fortress within a fortress, with multiple guards, locked storage rooms, and a complex system of seals and signatures that tracked every ingredient from acquisition to preparation. The young pharaoh's food was prepared by a team of cooks who had undergone extensive background investigations, whose families were essentially held hostage to ensure loyalty, and who knew that a single mistake could result in their immediate execution. The tasting ritual involved multiple servants sampling each dish in a specific sequence, waiting prescribed intervals to ensure no delayed action poisons were present, and then presenting the food on plates that were themselves tested for toxic coatings. The young pharaoh learned to observe these servants carefully, watching for any signs of distress, unusual behavior, or suspicious hesitation. They were taught to recognize the early symptoms of dozens of different poisons, from the barely perceptible tremor that indicated mercury poisoning to the slight flush that suggested arsenic contamination. Education continued throughout the day, with lessons that were both intellectual and tactical. Royal tutors taught hieroglyphics, while simultaneously explaining how written messages could contain hidden threats or coded assassination instructions. Mathematics lessons included calculations for determining safe distances from potential threats and estimating the range of various weapons. History classes focused heavily on the fates of previous pharaohs, with particular attention to those who had been murdered, overthrown, or mysteriously disappeared. Geography lessons were exercises in strategic thinking, as young pharaohs learned to identify potential escape routes from the palace, safe houses throughout the kingdom, and foreign lands that might offer refuge in times of crisis. They studied the layouts of Egypt's major cities, not as future sites of triumphal visits, but as potential battlefields where they might need to flee for their lives. Every temple, every fortress, every river crossing was evaluated for its defensive potential. The afternoons often brought military training, but this was warfare of a different sort than what ordinary soldiers learned. Young pharaohs practiced fighting in confined spaces, using improvised weapons, and defending themselves while wearing the heavy ceremonial garments they would be required to wear in public. They learned to use the golden staff of office as a weapon, to conceal blades within royal regalia, and to turn ceremonial objects into tools of survival. Language instruction went beyond Egyptian and included the tongues of neighboring kingdoms, not for diplomatic purposes but for survival. A pharaoh might need to disguise their identity, to blend in among foreign merchants, or to understand the conversations of foreign assassins. They learned to speak like commoners, to adopt different accents, and to convincingly portray people from various social classes and regions. The evening hours brought perhaps the most unsettling aspect of royal childhood: the bedtime stories. These were not tales of heroic adventure or magical kingdoms, but detailed accounts of how previous pharaohs had met their ends. Young rulers heard about Amenemheb, who was stabbed by his own brother during a religious ceremony. They learned about Senebkeh, whose mummy showed evidence of multiple axe wounds suggesting he was hacked to death by conspirators. They were told about pharaohs who had been poisoned by their wives, strangled by their viziers, or killed by their own bodyguards. These stories served a purpose beyond mere terror. They were case studies in survival, teaching young pharaohs to recognize the patterns that led to previous murders, to understand the motivations of potential assassins, and to avoid the mistakes that had proven fatal to their predecessors. Each tale came with lessons. Never turn your back on family. Never eat food that hasn't been properly tested. Never trust anyone completely. And always have an escape plan. The sleeping arrangements reflected the paranoid reality of royal life. The pharaoh's bedchamber was designed like a fortress, with multiple entrances and exits, hidden passages, and secret compartments containing weapons and supplies. The bed itself was positioned to provide maximum visibility of all entrances while offering quick access to escape routes. Guards were stationed not just outside the room but at strategic points throughout the palace, creating multiple layers of security that were also multiple opportunities for betrayal. Sleep, when it came, was light and fitful. Young pharaohs learned to wake at the slightest sound, to sleep with weapons within reach, and to trust their instincts about danger even in the darkness. They developed the ability to assess threats while appearing to sleep, to listen for approaching footsteps, and to distinguish between the normal sounds of the palace and the subtle indicators of danger. Rest was never truly restful for those destined to wear the double crown of Egypt. As royal children matured, they began to understand the true horror of their position. They realized that their beautiful palace was actually a prison, that their loving family was a nest of vipers, and that their divine status was both a blessing and a curse. They saw older siblings disappear in the night, witnessed the sudden illness of potential rivals, and learned to interpret the subtle signals that meant someone had fallen from favor. The golden toys of childhood gave way to golden chains of adulthood. The transition from prince to pharaoh was the most dangerous period of all. This was when succession disputes erupted, when rival claimants emerged, and when the most desperate assassination attempts occurred. Young pharaohs learned that coronation day was not a celebration, but a target date, that ascending the throne meant painting a larger bullseye on their backs. The crown was not just heavy with gold. It was heavy with the certainty that wearing it made survival infinitely more difficult by the time a royal child reached adolescence. They had been thoroughly indoctrinated into the paranoid world of pharaonic power. They had learned to smile while suspecting poison, to embrace while checking for daggers, and to trust while preparing for betrayal. They understood that being chosen by the gods meant being hunted by mortals, that divine kingship was the most dangerous job in the world, and that the Golden Throne was built on a foundation of fear, blood, and endless vigilance. The palace walls that had once seemed like protection now felt like barriers, keeping them trapped in a world where every sunrise brought new dangers and every sunset marked another day of survival. The royal children who had once played games now played for their lives, understanding that in the world of pharaonic power there were no winners, only survivors. And even survival was temporary, as every pharaoh knew that their magnificent tomb was being prepared, not just for their eventual death, but for the day when the golden prison finally claimed them. The golden halls of the royal palace echoed with laughter. But those who understood the true nature of pharaonic family life knew that every giggle could mask a plot, every embrace could conceal a blade, and every family dinner could be someone's last meal. In the world of ancient Egyptian royalty, blood relations were not bonds of love, but chains of mutual suspicion, where brothers killed brothers, mothers poisoned sons, and children learned to sleep with daggers under their pillows before they learned to walk properly. The pharaonic family tree was less a genealogy than a casualty list, with branches pruned by poison, severed by swords, and withered by calculated neglect. Royal marriages were not unions of love but mergers of political necessity, creating households where every member was simultaneously family and enemy, protector and potential assassin. The palace was filled with half-siblings who shared bloodlines but harbored murderous intention, stepmothers who viewed their husbands' other children as obstacles to their own offspring's advancement, and fathers who loved their children but understood that loving them might require killing them. Sibling rivalry in royal families took on deadly dimensions that would have horrified ordinary Egyptians. While common families might see brothers compete for their father's attention or approval, royal brothers competed for survival itself. The succession laws of ancient Egypt were deliberately ambiguous, allowing multiple sons to claim legitimate rights to the throne. This wasn't an oversight in the legal system. It was a deliberate design intended to ensure that only the strongest, smartest, and most ruthless would ultimately rule. The result was a family structure that functioned more like a gladiatorial arena than a household. The training began early and was remarkably systematic. Royal children were taught to view their siblings not as playmates but as future threats to be monitored, manipulated, or eliminated. They learned to smile while plotting, to embrace while calculating, and to share meals while checking for poison. The games they played were elaborate rehearsals for future assassination attempts, with toy swords replaced by real blades as they matured, and childhood pranks evolving into deadly serious attempts at eliminating competition. Mothers played perhaps the most complex and dangerous role in this family dynamic. Royal women often bore children to the pharaoh as part of political alliances, knowing that their own survival and status depended entirely on their child's success in the succession struggle. This created a system where maternal love became weaponized, where mothers would go to extraordinary lengths to eliminate threats to their children, including murdering their husbands, other wives, and children. The royal harem was not a place of leisure and luxury, but a battlefield where women fought proxy wars through their offspring. The case of Queen Taye illustrated the deadly nature of royal motherhood. Historical records suggest that she orchestrated the deaths of at least 3 of her stepchildren, using a network of loyal servants and carefully administered poisons to clear the path for her own son's ascension to the throne. She maintained the facade of a loving stepmother, while systematically eliminating her husband's children from previous marriages, demonstrating the ruthless calculation required for survival in the royal family. Her methods were so subtle that the deaths appeared natural, attributed to childhood illnesses or accidents rather than murder. Royal fathers faced an impossible psychological burden, knowing that their love for their children might ultimately require them to order their deaths. Pharaohs understood that leaving multiple viable heirs would inevitably lead to civil war, succession disputes, and the potential collapse of the dynasty. Some pharaohs attempted to solve this problem by designating a clear successor early and eliminating other claimants, while others preferred to let their children fight it out among themselves, reasoning that the survivor would be the strongest and most capable ruler. The palace architecture itself reflected the paranoid nature of royal family life. Living quarters were designed to prevent surprise attacks, with multiple escape routes, hidden passages, and carefully controlled access points. Family members rarely slept in the same wing of the palace, and even married couples often maintained separate residences within the royal complex. Dining halls were arranged to prevent poisoning attempts, with specific seating arrangements that kept potential enemies separated, and food service protocols that made contamination difficult. Family meals were elaborate productions that resembled military operations more than domestic gatherings. Each family member's food was prepared separately, tested multiple times, and served by different sets of servants to prevent coordinated poisoning attempts. Conversation was carefully monitored for hidden threats or coded messages, and even casual requests for salt or water were scrutinized for potential assassination signals. The royal family learned to communicate through subtle gestures and coded phrases, understanding that direct conversation was dangerous and that silence was often the safest option. The education system within royal families was designed to create effective killers rather than loving siblings. Children were taught to recognize the subtle signs of poisoning in their brothers and sisters, to identify the physical evidence of various assassination methods, and to distinguish between natural death and murder. They studied the family histories of previous dynasties, learning from the successes and failures of their predecessors in the deadly art of family survival. These lessons included detailed case studies of successful assassinations, failed murder attempts, and the consequences of showing mercy to potential rivals. Royal children learned to weaponize affection, using displays of love and loyalty to lower their siblings' guard before striking. They were taught to maintain detailed mental notes about their family members' habits, preferences, fears, and weaknesses, building psychological profiles that could be exploited later. The palace became a training ground for manipulation, where children learned to lie convincingly, to fake emotions, and to create elaborate deceptions that could be maintained for years before being activated for assassination purposes. The role of royal servants in family assassinations was both crucial and terrifying. Palace staff were caught between competing loyalties, knowing that serving one family member often meant betraying another. Servants were recruited as spies, reporting on the activities and conversations of various royal family members to their employers. They became carriers of poison, deliverers of threatening messages, and sometimes the actual instruments of murder. The most trusted servants were often those with the greatest access to potential victims, making loyalty a luxury that few could afford. Succession crises brought out the worst aspects of royal family dynamics, transforming the palace into a battlefield where family members openly hunted each other. When a pharaoh died without a clear successor, or when the designated heir was challenged by siblings, the royal compound would be transformed overnight into a fortress under siege. Family members would barricade themselves in their quarters, surround themselves with loyal guards, and begin systematic attempts to eliminate their rivals before being eliminated themselves. The assassination methods used within royal families were often more subtle and sophisticated than those employed against external enemies. Family members had access to their targets that outsiders could never achieve, allowing them to use slow-acting poisons, psychological warfare, and elaborate frame-ups that could destroy rivals without obviously implicating the perpetrator. They could exploit intimate knowledge of their victims' routines, phobias, and medical conditions to create assassination attempts that appeared to be accidents or natural deaths. Royal wives presented particular dangers and opportunities within the family assassination network. Foreign princesses married for political alliances often maintained loyalty to their birth families rather than their husbands, creating potential fifth columns within the royal household. Egyptian queens and concubines competed not only for their husbands' affection, but for the survival of their children, leading to complex webs of alliance and betrayal that could span decades. Some royal women became master poisoners, developing expertise in subtle toxins that could kill slowly and without detection. The psychological toll of living in such an environment was devastating for royal family members. They developed chronic paranoia, inability to form genuine emotional attachments, and a constant state of hypervigilance that made normal family relationships impossible. Royal children often suffered from what would now be recognized as severe anxiety disorders, manifesting in physical symptoms like chronic insomnia, digestive problems, and nervous tics that betrayed their constant fear of assassination. Family celebrations and religious ceremonies became particularly dangerous occasions, as they required family members to gather in the same location and lower their guard for ritual purposes. Royal weddings, coronations, and religious festivals were favorite opportunities for assassination attempts, as the ceremonial requirements made it difficult to maintain full security protocols. Family members learned to treat every gathering as a potential trap, every ceremony as a possible site of their own murder. The documentary evidence of royal family murders is extensive and chilling. Papyrus records detailed accusations of poisoning between royal siblings, while mummy examinations reveal evidence of violent deaths that were clearly not natural. Some pharaohs' remains show multiple stab wounds, indicating family members working together to ensure their victim's death. Others display evidence of slow poisoning, suggesting months or years of gradual murder through carefully administered toxin. The irony of royal family life was that the very bonds that should have provided security and support became the greatest sources of danger. Family members possessed the access, knowledge, and motivation necessary to carry out perfect murders, while their blood relationships provided both cover for their actions and justification for their motives. The closer the family relationship, the greater the potential threat, creating a system where love and loyalty became liabilities rather than assets. The palace staff developed elaborate protocols for managing family interactions, including rules about which family members could be alone together, restrictions on gift-giving between relatives, and careful monitoring of all family communications. Even casual conversations between royal siblings were often conducted in the presence of witnesses who could later testify that no assassination plots had been discussed. The natural intimacy of family life was replaced by formal protocols designed to prevent murder, creating households that functioned more like diplomatic missions than homes. As family members matured and the succession question became more pressing, the level of danger within the royal household would escalate dramatically. Brothers who had played together as children would begin viewing each other as existential threats, while sisters who had shared secrets would start calculating whether their siblings needed to die for their own children to survive. The transformation from loving family to murder conspiracy was gradual but inevitable, as the logic of succession made family affection a luxury that few could afford. The royal family dining rooms, bedchambers, and gathering spaces became crime scenes waiting to happen, filled with potential weapons, hiding places for assassins, and opportunities for private conversations that could seal someone's fate. Family members learned to think like criminals and victims simultaneously, always plotting while always watching for plots against themselves, creating a dynamic that made genuine family relationships impossible and turned the royal household into an elegant golden house of horrors where blood ties became death sentences. The royal kitchens of ancient Egypt operated like a fortress within a fortress, where every grain of wheat was a potential weapon, and every cup of wine could contain death. The elaborate meals that impressed foreign dignitaries and awed common subjects were actually elaborate productions of survival, where armies of food tasters, specialized cooks, and paranoid protocols stood between the pharaoh and a poison-induced death. In the world of royal dining, every bite was a gamble, every sip was a risk, and every meal was a small victory against those who would murder the divine ruler one mouthful at a time. The royal kitchen complex sprawled across an entire wing of the palace, containing multiple preparation areas, secure storage facilities, and specialized chambers for different types of food processing. Access was controlled through a series of checkpoints, each manned by guards who knew that a single security failure could result in their immediate execution. The kitchen staff underwent background investigations that extended back generations, with their families essentially held as hostages to ensure loyalty. Even trusted cooks were never allowed to work alone, as every stage of food preparation required multiple witnesses and cross-verification. The selection and procurement of ingredients represented the first line of defense against poisoning attempts. Royal buyers traveled to markets accompanied by armed guards and expert inspectors who examined every item for signs of contamination or tampering. Grains were tested for ergot fungus, which could cause hallucinations and death. Fruits were inspected for injection marks that might indicate poison had been introduced. Meat was examined for unusual discoloration or odors that could suggest toxic additives. Even water underwent extensive testing, as wells and streams could be contaminated by enemies seeking to poison the royal household. The storage systems were marvels of paranoid engineering, with multiple locked chambers, sealed containers, and complex rotation systems designed to prevent any single person from having access to large quantities of food. Different ingredients were stored in separate locations, making it impossible for a single conspirator to contaminate an entire meal. Seals and locks were changed regularly, with access limited to rotating teams of trusted personnel, who were never allowed to work the same shifts consecutively. Food preparation followed strict protocols that resembled military operations more than cooking. Each dish required multiple cooks working in sequence, with different individuals responsible for various stages of preparation. One cook might handle the initial ingredients, another would manage the cooking process, and a third would complete the final presentation. This system made it nearly impossible for any single person to poison a dish without detection, as multiple sets of eyes monitored every stage of preparation. The tasting system represented perhaps the most elaborate and grim aspect of royal dining security. Teams of food tasters were employed in rotating shifts, with different individuals responsible for testing different types of food. These brave or desperate souls understood that their job description included a high probability of death, as they were essentially human poison detectors whose lives were considered expendable in service of protecting the pharaoh. The tasters came from various backgrounds. Some were volunteers lured by promises of wealth for their families. Others were criminals given the choice between certain execution and possible survival. And still others were fanatically loyal servants who considered dying for their pharaoh to be the highest honor. The tasting protocols were elaborate and time-consuming, designed to detect both fast-acting and delayed-action poisons. Initial tasters would sample each dish immediately after preparation, then wait in monitored isolation for several hours to ensure no symptoms developed. Secondary tasters would then sample the same dishes, followed by additional waiting periods. Only after multiple rounds of testing, with all tasters remaining healthy, would food be considered safe for royal consumption. This process could take an entire day for a single meal, requiring the kitchen staff to work around the clock to maintain the pharaoh's dining schedule. Different types of poisons required different detection methods, and the royal kitchen maintained an extensive library of toxic substances and their symptoms. Fast-acting poisons like cyanide would be detected within minutes by the initial tasters, but slow-acting toxins like arsenic might not manifest symptoms for hours or even days. Some poisons were designed to be cumulative, causing no immediate harm but building up in the body over time until they reached lethal levels. The tasting system had to account for all these possibilities, creating complex schedules and rotation patterns that ensured comprehensive poison detection. The royal dining chambers themselves were designed as extensions of the kitchen security system, with controlled access points, monitored serving procedures, and elaborate protocols for food presentation. Servants who carried food from kitchen to table were searched for hidden vials of poison, watched by guards throughout their journey, and required to follow specific routes that passed multiple security checkpoints. The dining table was inspected before each meal for hidden compartments or toxic substances, and even the chairs and eating utensils underwent regular examination. The pharaoh's personal eating habits reflected a lifetime of paranoid training, with elaborate rituals designed to minimize poisoning risks. Food was served on plates made from specific materials that would change color if certain toxins were present. Eating utensils were made from metals that would react to various poisons, providing an additional layer of detection. The pharaoh learned to eat slowly and carefully, watching for any unusual tastes, smells, or textures that might indicate contamination. Even the order in which foods were consumed followed security protocols, with certain combinations avoided because they could mask the taste of poison or accelerate toxic effects. Water presented particular challenges for the royal security system, as it was essential for life but easy to contaminate. The pharaoh's drinking water came from carefully guarded wells or springs, transported in sealed containers, and tested multiple times before consumption. Some pharaohs employed specialized water tasters whose only job was to sample liquids throughout the day, while others relied on elaborate filtration systems and chemical tests to detect contamination. Wine and beer underwent even more extensive testing, as their complex flavors could easily mask the taste of various poisons. The psychological impact of constant food-related paranoia was devastating for royal family members, who could never enjoy a simple meal without fearing for their lives. Royal children learned to associate eating with danger, developing elaborate personal rituals and superstitions around food consumption. Some pharaohs became obsessive about their eating habits, insisting on consuming only specific foods prepared by particular cooks at predetermined times. Others developed eating disorders, either consuming enormous quantities of food in an attempt to dilute potential poisons, or eating so little that malnutrition became a greater threat than assassination. Foreign diplomatic meals presented extraordinary security challenges, as refusing to eat food prepared by visiting dignitaries could be considered insulting, while consuming it could be suicidal. Royal protocol specialists developed elaborate compromises, including mutual food preparation ceremonies, where both hosts and guests participated in cooking, shared tasting rituals where everyone consumed the same dishes simultaneously, and complex gift exchanges that allowed for discreet poison testing. These diplomatic dinners became elaborate theatrical productions where every gesture was choreographed to maintain both safety and diplomatic courtesy. The kitchen staff lived under constant suspicion and surveillance, knowing that any illness or death suffered by the royal family would likely result in their own execution. Cooks developed elaborate personal protection rituals, often testing their own food preparation areas for contamination and maintaining detailed records of every ingredient they used. The most trusted kitchen workers were those who had served for decades without incident, but even they understood that a single mistake or false accusation could end their lives. Seasonal changes in food availability created additional security concerns, as new ingredients required new testing protocols and unfamiliar foods presented unknown risks. The royal kitchen maintained extensive records of seasonal poisoning attempts, noting which times of year were most dangerous and which foods were most commonly used to conceal toxins. Harvest festivals and religious celebrations that featured special foods required extra security measures, as these occasions provided cover for assassination attempts and opportunities to introduce exotic poison. The economic cost of royal food security was enormous, requiring vast resources for guards, tasters, specialized equipment, and elaborate preparation facilities. Some estimates suggest that feeding a single pharaoh safely cost more than maintaining an entire army regiment. But the alternative, a successfully poisoned ruler, could destabilize the entire kingdom. The expense was considered worthwhile, but it meant that enormous resources were diverted from other royal functions to maintain the elaborate food security apparatus. Medical knowledge about poisons was both blessing and curse for the royal household, as understanding toxic substances helped with detection, but also provided assassination techniques to potential enemies. Royal physicians maintained detailed knowledge of hundreds of different poisons, their symptoms, antidotes, and methods of administration. This information was carefully guarded, but inevitably leaked to those who sought to use it for murder rather than protection. The same expertise that saved pharaohs from poisoning attempts also enabled more sophisticated assassination plots. The preparation of antidotes became a crucial aspect of royal food security, with palace pharmacists maintaining stocks of treatments for various known poisons. Some antidotes were administered preventively, with pharaohs consuming small amounts of protective substances before meals. Others were kept ready for immediate use if poisoning was suspected. The effectiveness of these treatments varied widely, and many antidotes were themselves dangerous, creating situations where the cure could be worse than the poison. Religious aspects of royal dining added another layer of complexity to food security, as certain meals were considered sacred and had to be prepared according to specific ritual requirements that might conflict with security protocols. Temple offerings and ceremonial feasts required the pharaoh to consume foods that had been blessed by priests, handled by temple personnel, and prepared according to ancient traditions that predated modern security concern. These religious obligations created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit, forcing royal security to develop compromises between spiritual requirements and physical safety. The documentation of successful and attempted poisonings within royal households created a grim historical record that influenced security procedures for generations. Palace archives contain detailed accounts of how various pharaohs had been murdered through poisoned food, which toxins had been used, and how the assassination plots had been discovered or concealed. These records served as both warnings and instruction manuals, helping future generations avoid past mistakes, while inadvertently providing blueprints for new assassination attempts. Personal food preferences became security liabilities for pharaohs, as enemies could exploit known dietary habits to plan poisoning attempts. A pharaoh's love for particular fruits, wines, or delicacies created opportunities for targeted contamination that would be more likely to succeed than random poisoning attempts. Royal food security specialists worked to vary dining habits, introduce unexpected menu changes, and eliminate predictable patterns that assassins could exploit. The constant fear of poisoning affected not just what pharaohs ate, but how they ate, transforming meals from pleasurable experiences into tense security operations. Royal banquets became elaborate performances where every participant understood their role in the ongoing battle against assassination, where every toast could be a farewell, and where the simple act of sharing a meal became an act of trust that could prove fatal. The golden plates and jeweled goblets that impressed visitors concealed a reality where every bite could be the last, every sip could bring death, and every meal was a small victory in the ongoing war for survival that defined pharaonic life. The morning rays of Ra pierced through the ceremonial chamber, as the young pharaoh knelt before the massive golden statue of Horus, his divine patron. But this was no ordinary prayer session. This was a desperate attempt to maintain the impossible facade that he was simultaneously human and divine, mortal and eternal, fallible and infallible. The weight of godhood pressed down upon his shoulders like the massive stone blocks of his future pyramid, crushing his humanity beneath the relentless demands of divinity. Every breath he took had to be divine, every word had to be perfect, and every action had to reflect the will of the gods. Because the moment his subjects began to doubt his divinity was the moment his reign, and quite possibly his life, would end. The psychological burden of being worshipped as a living god was perhaps the most devastating aspect of pharaonic life, one that broke minds more effectively than any torture device, and destroyed souls more thoroughly than any battlefield defeat. From the moment of coronation, pharaohs were expected to embody perfection while living in imperfect human bodies, to demonstrate divine wisdom while possessing mortal limitations, and to remain serene and godlike while facing the constant terror of assassination, family betrayal, and political upheaval. The contradiction was maddening. They were told they were gods while being reminded daily that they could be killed like any mortal. The daily rituals of divine kingship began before dawn and continued long after sunset, creating an exhausting schedule that left little time for human needs or personal reflection. The pharaoh's day started with the sacred awakening ceremony, where priests would enter the royal chamber and perform elaborate rituals to awaken the god within the royal body. This wasn't merely symbolic. The priests genuinely believed they were tending to a divine being, and any sign of human weakness or irritation from the pharaoh could be interpreted as evidence that the gods were displeased or that the divine essence was departing from the royal body. The morning ablutions were religious ceremonies rather than personal hygiene routines, with every aspect of washing, dressing, and grooming prescribed by ancient ritual requirements. Sacred oils had to be applied in specific patterns, while priests chanted protective spells. The royal regalia wasn't just clothing, but divine armor that had to be donned in precise sequences, while invoking various deities. The famous double crown of Egypt wasn't merely a symbol of political power, but a religious artifact so sacred that touching it incorrectly could be punishable by death. The pharaoh learned to see his own body not as his personal possession, but as a temple housing divine essence that required constant ritual maintenance. Public appearances became performances of divinity that demanded perfect execution under impossible pressure. When the pharaoh appeared before his subjects, he couldn't simply walk, he had to glide with divine grace. He couldn't speak normally. Every word had to carry the weight of divine authority. He couldn't show emotion. Gods didn't experience fear, anger, or uncertainty like mortals. The pharaoh had to maintain this facade while knowing that assassins might be in the crowd, that political enemies were watching for any sign of weakness, and that a single slip in divine performance could undermine his entire reign. The religious ceremonies were particularly torturous, as they required the pharaoh to perform complex rituals perfectly, while genuinely believing in his own divinity. During temple ceremonies, the pharaoh had to commune with statues of gods, as if they were living beings, offer prayers to deities, while knowing he was supposed to be their equal, and perform sacrificial rituals that often involved killing animals or, in extreme cases, human beings. The psychological strain of repeatedly performing these rituals while maintaining belief in their efficacy and his own divine nature created a form of spiritual schizophrenia that left many pharaohs mentally unstable. The burden of divine infallibility was crushing in its relentless demands. Gods don't make mistakes, so pharaohs couldn't admit errors in judgment, couldn't change their minds about important decisions, and couldn't show uncertainty about complex political or military situations. They had to project confidence and wisdom even when faced with impossible choices, natural disasters they couldn't control, or military defeats that clearly demonstrated their mortality. The need to appear divinely wise while possessing human limitations forced pharaohs to rely heavily on advisors and priests, creating dependencies that could be exploited by those seeking to control or manipulate them. The isolation imposed by divine status was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of pharaonic life. Gods didn't have friends. They had worshippers. They didn't enjoy casual conversations. They received formal petitions. They didn't experience human affection. They accepted devotion and tribute. Pharaohs were surrounded by people constantly, but they were utterly alone in their divine roles, unable to form genuine human relationships because their divine status made authentic emotional connections impossible. Everyone who approached them did so with ulterior motives, seeking divine favor, political advantage, or protection from the god king's wrath. Family relationships became particularly complex when one member was considered divine while others remained mortal. Royal spouses had to worship their husband while sharing his bed, creating intimate relationships that were simultaneously personal and religious. Royal children had to revere their father as a god while needing him as a human parent, leading to psychological confusion and emotional damage that could last lifetimes. The pharaoh's own parents, if still living, faced the bizarre situation of having their child become their deity, fundamentally altering family dynamics in ways that defied natural human relationship. The divine dietary restrictions added another layer of complexity to royal life, as gods were expected to consume only the purest foods prepared according to ancient religious requirements. Certain foods were forbidden because they were associated with hostile deities, while others were mandatory during specific religious seasons. The pharaoh's diet became a complex calendar of religious observances that often conflicted with nutritional needs or personal preferences. Some pharaohs developed severe health problems due to religious dietary restrictions that prevented them from eating foods necessary for proper nutrition. The requirement to demonstrate divine powers created constant pressure to perform miracles or show supernatural abilities that pharaohs obviously didn't possess. They were expected to predict the future, control the weather, heal the sick, and ensure the annual flooding of the Nile, all while knowing they had no actual supernatural abilities. Pharaohs developed elaborate systems of staged miracles, carefully orchestrated events that appeared supernatural to observers, but required extensive behind-the-scenes preparation by priests and court magicians. The constant fear of being exposed as merely human while claiming divine powers created chronic anxiety that manifested in physical symptoms and mental instability. The religious calendar imposed an exhausting schedule of ceremonies, festivals, and ritual obligations that left pharaohs with little time for governing or personal life. Major religious festivals could last for days or weeks, requiring the pharaoh's constant participation in elaborate ceremonies that were physically and emotionally draining. The pharaoh had to maintain divine composure while performing rituals that might involve standing motionless for hours, wearing heavy ceremonial garments in extreme heat, or participating in complex religious dramas that required precise timing and perfect execution. Failure to perform these rituals correctly was seen as evidence of divine displeasure that could destabilize the entire kingdom. The burden of representing divine justice meant that pharaohs had to make legal decisions that affected thousands of lives while claiming that their judgments came directly from the gods. They couldn't simply apply human reasoning or personal morality. They had to channel divine will in every legal ruling. This created enormous pressure to appear wise and just while dealing with complex legal cases that often had no clear right answers. Pharaohs who made unpopular legal decisions faced accusations that they had lost divine favor, while those who changed their rulings appeared indecisive and potentially undivine. The physical toll of maintaining divine appearances was severe, as pharaohs were required to wear heavy ceremonial regalia for extended periods, maintain perfect posture during long ceremonies, and perform physically demanding rituals regardless of their health or physical condition. The famous golden funeral mask of Tutankhamun, while beautiful, weighed over 20 pounds and had to be worn for hours during religious ceremonies. Royal regalia included heavy crowns, elaborate jewelry, and ceremonial weapons that were designed to impress rather than provide comfort. Many pharaohs developed chronic back problems, joint pain, and other physical ailments from the constant strain of maintaining divine appearances. The responsibility for cosmic order placed pharaohs under pressure that extended far beyond normal political leadership. They weren't just responsible for governing Egypt. They were responsible for maintaining the balance between order and chaos that kept the universe functioning properly. Natural disasters, military defeats, famines, or plagues were all interpreted as evidence that the pharaoh had failed in his divine duties. This cosmic responsibility created a form of supernatural anxiety where pharaohs felt personally responsible for events completely beyond their control, leading to chronic stress and psychological disorders that affected their ability to govern effectively. The divine sexual obligations created additional psychological burdens, as pharaohs were expected to produce heirs, while maintaining their divine status during intimate relationships. Royal marriages were religious ceremonies as much as political alliances, and the consummation of these marriages was considered a sacred act that had to be performed according to religious requirements. The pressure to produce male heirs while maintaining divine dignity during intimate moments created complex psychological conflicts that affected both pharaohs and their spouses. The economic burden of maintaining divine status was enormous, requiring vast resources for religious ceremonies, temple maintenance, and the elaborate court structure necessary to support the pharaoh's divine role. Significant portions of Egypt's wealth were dedicated to maintaining the illusion of pharaonic divinity, from the construction of massive temples to the support of enormous priestly bureaucracies. This economic drain often conflicted with practical governance needs, forcing pharaohs to choose between maintaining their divine image and addressing pressing social or military problems. The educational requirements for divine kingship went far beyond normal royal training, as pharaohs had to master complex religious knowledge, ritualistic procedures, and theological concepts that would allow them to convincingly portray divine beings. They studied ancient texts that described the attributes and behaviors of various gods, learned to perform religious ceremonies with perfect precision, and memorized vast amounts of ritual knowledge that had been passed down through generations of priests. This religious education often consumed so much time that pharaohs received inadequate training in practical governance, military strategy, or diplomatic skills. The succession problems created by divine kingship were particularly complex, as the transfer of divine essence from one pharaoh to another required elaborate religious ceremonies and theological justifications. The death of a god-king created a cosmic crisis that had to be resolved through proper religious procedures, while the coronation of a new pharaoh required convincing the population that divine essence had successfully transferred to the new ruler. These religious requirements often conflicted with political necessities, creating succession crises that could destabilize the entire kingdom. The ultimate irony of pharaonic divinity was that the more successfully a pharaoh convinced his subjects of his divine nature, the more isolated and psychologically damaged he became. The most effective god-kings were often the most mentally unstable, having internalized their divine roles so completely that they lost touch with their human nature. They lived in a world where everyone worshipped them, but no one truly knew them, where they wielded enormous power but couldn't use it to address their own psychological suffering, and where they were surrounded by luxury but deprived of the simple human connections that make life meaningful. The golden thrones and jeweled crowns that symbolized pharaonic power were actually instruments of psychological torture, forcing human beings to live as gods, while remaining trapped in mortal bodies that could feel pain, fear, and loneliness. The divine pharaohs, who seemed so powerful and majestic to their subjects, were often broken individuals struggling to maintain impossible standards, while carrying the weight of cosmic responsibility on shoulders that were ultimately, tragically, only human. The gods that ancient Egyptians worshipped were in the end just people wearing golden masks that they could never remove, performing divine roles that slowly destroyed their humanity one perfect, terrible day at a time. The royal court of ancient Egypt was a glittering web of deception, where every smile concealed a dagger, every bow masked a plot, and every whispered conversation could reshape the destiny of kingdoms. Behind the golden facades and elaborate ceremonies, a complex ecosystem of ambitious nobles, scheming priests, calculating viziers, and foreign spies engaged in a deadly game where the stakes were ultimate power and the penalty for losing was death. The pharaoh, sitting atop this pyramid of intrigue, was simultaneously the most powerful person in the known world and the most vulnerable target of an endless array of conspiracies, betrayals, and assassination plots. The structure of the Egyptian court was deliberately designed to create competition and mutual surveillance among potential threats to pharaonic power. Nobles were granted overlapping responsibilities that forced them to compete with each other for royal favor, while priests from different temples were given conflicting authorities that prevented any single religious faction from accumulating too much influence. Military commanders were rotated frequently and required to share command responsibilities, making it difficult for any general to build the personal loyalty necessary for a successful coup. This system of checks and balances was effective at preventing single individuals from threatening the throne, but it also created an environment of constant paranoia and backstabbing that made the court a dangerous place for everyone, including the pharaoh. The viziers, as the pharaoh's chief administrators, occupied perhaps the most perilous positions in the entire court hierarchy. They wielded enormous power over daily governance, controlled access to the pharaoh, and managed the vast bureaucracy that kept Egypt functioning. This authority made them indispensable to pharaonic rule, but it also made them existential threats that had to be carefully managed. Smart pharaohs appointed multiple viziers with overlapping responsibilities, ensuring that no single administrator could control enough of the government to stage a successful coup. Paranoid pharaohs replaced their viziers frequently, sometimes annually, to prevent them from building independent power bases. The case of Vizier Amenemheb during the reign of Thutmose III illustrated the deadly nature of court politics. Historical records suggest that Amenemheb spent years carefully building a network of loyal officials throughout the government while maintaining a facade of perfect loyalty to his pharaoh. He manipulated tax collection records to enrich his supporters, appointed his allies to key military positions, and gradually gained control over enough of the administration to pose a serious threat to royal authority. When Thutmose III finally recognized the danger, the resulting purge eliminated not only Amenemheb but hundreds of officials suspected of supporting him, fundamentally restructuring the government and creating a climate of terror that lasted for years. The priestly class presented unique challenges for pharaonic authority, as their religious authority could be used to legitimize or delegitimize royal rule. High priests controlled enormous wealth through temple offerings, commanded the loyalty of thousands of temple workers, and possessed the theological knowledge necessary to challenge pharaonic claims to divinity. The most dangerous priests were those who served gods whose theological domains overlapped with pharaonic authority, creating potential conflicts between divine and royal power. Pharaohs had to carefully balance their relationships with various priestly factions, supporting some while suppressing others, to prevent any single religious group from accumulating enough influence to challenge royal supremacy. The cult of Amun at Thebes represented the most persistent threat to pharaonic authority throughout Egyptian history. The priests of Amun controlled vast temple complexes, enormous agricultural estates, and trade networks that generated wealth rivaling that of the royal treasury. They claimed direct communication with one of Egypt's most powerful gods, and possessed the theological authority to declare pharaohs illegitimate if they fell out of divine favor. Several pharaohs, including Akhenaten, attempted to break the power of the Amun priesthood by promoting alternative gods or relocating the capital away from Thebes. But these efforts often created more problems than they solved, as religious disruption could destabilize the entire kingdom. Foreign ambassadors and diplomatic missions created additional layers of complexity in court politics, as they represented potential allies or enemies whose true loyalties were always suspect. Egyptian courts hosted representatives from Nubia, Syria, Mesopotamia, and other neighboring kingdoms, all of whom were gathering intelligence, seeking advantages for their homelands, and potentially plotting against Egyptian interests. These foreign diplomats often formed alliances with Egyptian court factions, providing external support for internal conspiracies or offering refuge to Egyptian officials who fell out of favor with the pharaoh. The harem politics were particularly treacherous, as royal wives and concubines competed not only for personal status but for their children's positions in the succession. Foreign princesses married for diplomatic purposes often maintained stronger loyalties to their birth families than to their Egyptian husbands, creating potential fifth columns within the royal household. Egyptian queens and concubines formed complex alliances with court officials, priestly factions, and foreign diplomats, using their intimate access to the pharaoh to gather information and influence royal decisions. The harem became a hotbed of espionage where bedroom conversations could determine foreign policy and pillow talk could trigger international incidents. The military commanders represented both the pharaoh's greatest protection and his most dangerous potential enemies. Successful generals commanded the personal loyalty of their troops, controlled access to weapons and fortifications, and possessed the tactical knowledge necessary to stage successful coups. Pharaohs had to carefully balance the need for competent military leadership against the risk of creating potential usurpers. Some pharaohs rotated command positions frequently to prevent generals from building independent power bases, while others appointed family members to key military positions, despite their potential incompetence, reasoning that blood loyalty was more reliable than professional competence. The case of General Horemheb during the Amarna period demonstrated both the opportunities and dangers created by military involvement in court politics. Horemheb used his position as chief military commander to gradually eliminate rivals, consolidate power, and eventually claim the throne for himself after the deaths of Tutankhamun and Ah. His success was possible because the religious and political chaos of the Amarna period had weakened traditional court structures, creating opportunities for a skilled military leader to seize power. Horemheb's eventual coronation as pharaoh showed that military coups were not only possible but could be successful if properly executed by competent generals. The intelligence networks that operated within Egyptian courts were sophisticated and extensive, involving professional spies, informants, and surveillance specialists who monitored potential threats to royal authority. These networks gathered information about court conversations, personal relationships, financial transactions, and correspondence between officials and foreign contacts. The pharaoh's spy masters maintained detailed files on court personnel, tracking their loyalties, vulnerabilities, and potential for treason. This intelligence gathering was essential for royal survival, but it also created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that made normal human relationships difficult or impossible. Economic manipulation was a powerful tool in court politics, as officials' loyalty could often be bought or sold through careful management of financial rewards and punishments. Pharaohs used land grants, tax exemptions, and trade monopolies to reward supporters, while employing financial pressure, property confiscation, and economic sanctions to punish opponents. The complex Egyptian economy provided numerous opportunities for corruption, embezzlement, and financial manipulation that could be exploited by both royal authorities and their enemies. Officials who controlled tax collection, trade regulation, or public works projects wielded enormous informal power that could be used to support or undermine pharaonic authority. The architectural design of royal palaces reflected the paranoid realities of court politics, with elaborate security measures designed to prevent assassination attempts and espionage activities. Throne rooms were constructed with multiple entrances and exits to provide escape routes for the pharaoh, while audience chambers included hidden compartments where guards could observe proceedings without being seen. Private royal quarters featured secret passages, concealed weapons caches, and communication systems that allowed the pharaoh to summon help or escape danger. Even decorative elements like wall paintings and sculptural reliefs often included hidden symbols or coded messages that could convey information to allies or warn of potential threats. The ceremonial aspects of court life served political and security functions beyond their obvious religious and social purposes. Elaborate court rituals created opportunities for officials to demonstrate their loyalty while also providing structured environments where potential threats could be monitored and controlled. Seating arrangements at court ceremonies conveyed political messages about relative status and royal favor, while participation in religious rituals demonstrated theological orthodoxy and personal loyalty to pharaonic authority. The pharaoh's public appearances were carefully choreographed performances designed to project power and stability while minimizing security risks. Communication within the court operated through complex networks of formal and informal channels that officials had to navigate carefully to avoid giving offense or revealing sensitive information. Official correspondence followed strict protocols that included coded language, ceremonial phrases, and bureaucratic procedures designed to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive information. Informal communication relied on trusted intermediaries, carefully arranged private meetings, and subtle signals that could convey messages without creating evidence of treasonous conversations. Court officials developed sophisticated skills in reading between the lines of official communications while maintaining plausible deniability about their own political activities. The seasonal rhythms of court life created predictable patterns that could be exploited by conspirators, while also providing opportunities for royal authorities to monitor and control potential threats. Religious festivals brought together large numbers of officials in settings where surveillance was difficult, but coordination was possible. Military campaigns removed key personnel from the court, while potentially creating opportunities for coups or succession disputes. Agricultural seasons affected tax collection and resource availability, creating economic pressures that could destabilize political arrangements. Successful court politicians learned to anticipate these seasonal vulnerabilities, while positioning themselves to take advantage of opportunities created by predictable events. Personal relationships within the court were complicated by the constant awareness that today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy. Depending on changing political circumstances and royal favor, officials formed strategic friendships based on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection, created marriage alliances that served political purposes, and maintained social connections that could provide protection or advancement opportunities. These calculated relationships created a social environment where authentic emotion was dangerous and genuine trust was potentially fatal. Court members became skilled actors who could maintain friendly facades while privately plotting against each other. The documentation of court intrigue was both necessary for administrative purposes and dangerous for those involved in questionable activities. Official records had to be maintained for tax collection, legal proceedings, and diplomatic correspondence, but these documents could also provide evidence of treasonous activities or unauthorized communications. Scribes and record keepers occupied sensitive positions as they had access to potentially damaging information about court officials and royal activities. Some officials developed elaborate systems for maintaining secret records or destroying sensitive documents, while others relied on oral communication and personal networks to avoid creating written evidence of their political activities. The psychological toll of constant political maneuvering affected everyone in the court, from the pharaoh to the lowest-ranking officials. The need for constant vigilance, the inability to trust even close associates, and the awareness that any mistake could be fatal created chronic stress that manifested in physical illness, mental instability, and behavioral abnormalities. Some court officials developed elaborate personal security rituals, while others became reclusive or paranoid. The most successful court politicians were often those who had learned to compartmentalize their emotions and operate effectively in an environment of constant deception and betrayal. The international dimensions of court politics meant that Egyptian conspiracies often had foreign connections, with neighboring kingdoms seeking to influence Egyptian policy through bribery, espionage, or support for Egyptian factions favorable to their interests. Foreign gold could finance domestic conspiracies, while promises of external military support could encourage ambitious officials to attempt coups or rebellions. Pharaohs had to consider not only domestic threats but also the possibility that internal enemies were receiving support from foreign sources. This international aspect of court politics made conspiracy detection more difficult while also providing opportunities for pharaonic authorities to exploit foreign connections for their own purposes. The royal court that appeared so magnificent to foreign visitors and common subjects was actually a deadly arena where survival required constant vigilance, perfect political instincts, and the ability to navigate competing loyalties without making fatal mistakes. The golden halls and elaborate ceremonies concealed a reality where every conversation was potentially treasonous, every relationship was strategically calculated, and every day brought new opportunities for advancement or destruction. The pharaoh, sitting at the center of this web of intrigue, wielded enormous power but lived in constant fear of the very people who served him. Understanding that the price of political miscalculation was not merely loss of position, but loss of life itself. From the moment a pharaoh was crowned, the construction of his tomb began. And with it, a lifetime of obsessive planning for death that would consume enormous resources, dominate royal thinking, and create new vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The pharaoh's tomb was not simply a burial place, but a fortress designed to protect his body and treasures for eternity. A religious complex that would ensure his successful journey to the afterlife. And paradoxically, a massive target that would attract grave robbers, political enemies, and ambitious successors for thousands of years. The irony was devastating. The very preparations meant to ensure eternal security often guaranteed that the pharaoh would find no peace even in death. The tomb construction projects were among the largest and most complex undertakings in the ancient world, requiring decades of work by thousands of laborers, craftsmen, engineers, and artists. These massive projects consumed significant portions of Egypt's national wealth, diverted resources from military campaigns and public works, and created logistical challenges that tested the limits of ancient Egyptian organizational capabilities. The pharaoh had to balance the religious necessity of proper tomb preparation against the practical needs of governing a living kingdom, often facing criticism from officials who saw tomb construction as wasteful extravagance that weakened Egypt's military and economic power. The location selection for royal tombs involved complex considerations of security, religious significance, and practical accessibility that often conflicted with each other. Remote locations in the Valley of the Kings provided security against casual grave robbers, but made tomb construction difficult and expensive. Sites near major cities offered better access for construction crews, but increased the risk of discovery by potential thieves. Religious requirements demanded that tombs be positioned according to ancient theological principles, often in locations that were geologically unsuitable for large-scale construction. Pharaohs frequently changed their minds about tomb locations, abandoning partially completed projects and starting over in new sites, wasting enormous amounts of resources and time. The architectural design of royal tombs reflected the paranoid mindset of pharaohs who understood that death would not end their vulnerability to enemies. Tombs included multiple false chambers designed to confuse grave robbers, hidden passages that provided secret access to burial chambers, and elaborate trap systems intended to kill or capture intruders. Some tombs featured flooding mechanisms that could drown thieves, falling stone blocks that would crush grave robbers, and concealed pits filled with spikes or venomous snakes. The most sophisticated tombs included psychological warfare elements designed to terrify potential intruders with curses, horrifying artwork, and deliberately unsettling architectural features. The workforce employed in tomb construction represented a significant security risk, as these individuals possessed intimate knowledge of tomb layouts, trap systems, and treasure locations that could be valuable to grave robbers or political enemies. Pharaohs employed various strategies to manage this security threat, including the systematic execution of key workers after tomb completion, the relocation of construction crews to remote locations where they could be monitored, and the compartmentalization of construction knowledge, so that no single individual understood the complete tomb design. Some pharaohs used foreign slaves or prisoners of war for tomb construction, reasoning that these workers had less incentive to share information with domestic grave robbers. The treasure accumulation that accompanied tomb construction created additional security challenges, as the vast wealth assembled for burial purposes had to be protected during the pharaoh's lifetime, while remaining accessible for the eventual funeral ceremony. Royal treasuries became fortress-like installations, with elaborate security systems, multiple locks and seals, and rotating guard schedules designed to prevent theft by both external enemies and internal conspirators. The concentration of so much wealth in one location created tempting targets for ambitious officials, foreign raiders, and desperate citizens during times of economic hardship. The religious requirements for proper burial created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit to deny pharaohs their expected afterlife. Ancient Egyptian theology demanded that specific rituals be performed correctly, particular objects be included in burial chambers, and certain magical texts be inscribed properly for the deceased pharaoh to successfully navigate the afterlife journey. Enemies who understood these requirements could sabotage burial preparations by destroying essential objects, corrupting religious texts, or preventing proper ritual performance. Some succession disputes involved attempts to deny rival claimants proper burial, effectively damning them to spiritual destruction even after death. The mummification process itself was a complex and vulnerable procedure that required weeks of careful preparation by specialized priests and embalmers who possessed sensitive knowledge about royal anatomy, burial procedures, and tomb security. The embalmers who prepared royal mummies knew intimate details about the pharaoh's physical condition, cause of death, and burial arrangements that could be politically or personally embarrassing. Some pharaohs were murdered during the mummification process by embalmers working for enemies who wanted to ensure that the deceased ruler would not successfully reach the afterlife. The documentation of tomb construction and burial procedures created detailed records that had to be maintained for religious and administrative purposes, but also provided potential roadmaps for grave robbers and enemies seeking to desecrate royal burials. Scribes and architects maintained precise plans of tomb layouts, inventories of burial treasures, and schedules of construction activities that represented sensitive intelligence that had to be carefully guarded. Some of these documents were deliberately falsified to confuse potential tomb robbers, while others were hidden in secure locations or destroyed after the pharaoh's burial to prevent their misuse. The economic impact of tomb construction often created political problems that could destabilize pharaonic rule during the ruler's lifetime. The enormous costs of tomb building required heavy taxation, forced labor conscription, and resource allocation that could anger subjects and create opportunities for rebellion or foreign invasion. Some pharaohs faced civil unrest or military mutinies caused by the economic burdens of tomb construction, while others had to abandon or scale back tomb projects due to financial constraints or political pressure. The irony was that preparations for death could actually cause the pharaoh's demise by weakening his kingdom and creating enemies among his own people. The international implications of tomb construction were significant, as the massive wealth displayed in royal burial preparations attracted attention from foreign kingdoms that might be tempted to invade Egypt or support domestic conspiracies against pharaonic rule. Foreign spies and diplomats carefully observed Egyptian tomb construction projects, gathering intelligence about Egyptian wealth, military capabilities, and internal stability that could be used for hostile purposes. Some foreign rulers timed their invasions or diplomatic pressure to coincide with periods when pharaohs were heavily invested in tomb construction and therefore less able to respond to external threats. The succession implications of tomb construction were complex and often created conflicts between pharaohs and their potential heirs. Crown princes who expected to inherit power sometimes resented the enormous resources devoted to their father's tomb construction, preferring that these resources be used for military campaigns, public works, or treasury accumulation that would benefit their own future reigns. Some succession disputes were triggered by disagreements over tomb construction priorities, while others involved attempts by potential heirs to gain control of their predecessors' burial treasures. The security systems developed for tomb protection often became models for palace security, creating feedback loops where lessons learned from protecting dead pharaohs were applied to protecting living ones. Architectural innovations developed for tomb construction influenced palace design, while security technologies created for burial protection were adapted for royal residence defense. The expertise developed by tomb security specialists made them valuable consultants for palace protection, but it also made them potential security risks if they were recruited by enemies seeking to attack royal residence. The psychological impact of constant death preparation was devastating for pharaohs who had to live with daily reminders of their own mortality while maintaining the facade of divine immortality. The regular inspections of tomb construction progress, the accumulation of burial treasures, and the testing of mummification procedures created a morbid atmosphere that affected royal mental health and decision-making. Some pharaohs became obsessed with death preparation to the exclusion of governing responsibilities, while others developed elaborate denial mechanisms that prevented them from adequately preparing for their own deaths. The timing of tomb completion created strategic dilemmas for pharaohs who had to balance the religious necessity of proper burial preparation against the security risks of having a completed tomb that could attract grave robbers or enemies. Early tomb completion provided security against unexpected death, but created decades of vulnerability to theft or sabotage. Late tomb completion reduced theft risks but created spiritual dangers if the pharaoh died before proper burial preparations were finished. Some pharaohs maintained multiple tomb projects simultaneously, hoping to confuse potential enemies about their actual burial plans. The quality control requirements for tomb construction demanded that pharaohs personally inspect construction progress, burial preparations, and security systems, but these inspection visits created opportunities for assassination attempts or accidents that could kill the pharaoh during his lifetime. Tomb construction sites were inherently dangerous places with deep excavations, heavy construction equipment, and potential structural collapses that could injure or kill visitors. Some pharaohs were killed during tomb inspections by assassins who took advantage of the isolated locations and limited security presence at construction sites. The religious calendar created temporal vulnerabilities in tomb security, as certain seasons required specific construction activities, burial preparations, or ritual performances that could be disrupted by enemies seeking to deny pharaohs proper afterlife preparation. Major religious festivals often involved tomb-related ceremonies that provided opportunities for sabotage or assassination attempts. The astronomical alignments required for proper tomb construction created timing constraints that enemies could exploit by disrupting construction schedules or preventing essential building activities. The storage and transportation of burial treasures created logistical challenges that exposed pharaohs to theft, robbery, or military attack during their lifetimes. The movement of precious objects from royal workshops to tomb sites required armed escorts, secure transportation, and coordinated timing that created predictable patterns that could be exploited by bandits or enemies. Some pharaohs lost significant portions of their burial treasures to theft during transportation, while others were attacked during treasure movement operations. The foreign craftsmen and artists employed in tomb construction brought specialized skills that were essential for proper burial preparation, but also created security risks as these individuals often maintained loyalties to their home countries and could serve as spies or saboteurs. Egyptian pharaohs relied heavily on foreign expertise for certain aspects of tomb construction, including specialized stonework, precious metal crafting, and artistic decoration that required skills not available among domestic workers. These foreign specialists possessed intimate knowledge of tomb layouts and security systems that could be valuable to Egypt's enemies. The maintenance requirements for tomb security created ongoing expenses and vulnerabilities that persisted throughout the pharaoh's lifetime and beyond. Tomb guard forces had to be maintained, security systems had to be tested and repaired, and access controls had to be updated regularly to prevent deterioration of protective measures. The cost of tomb maintenance often exceeded the original construction expenses, creating long-term financial burdens that could affect Egypt's economic stability and military readiness. The documentation preservation requirements for tomb construction created archives that had to be protected from theft, destruction, or unauthorized access, while remaining available for construction management and religious purposes. These archives contained sensitive information about tomb security, treasure locations, and burial procedures that could be extremely valuable to grave robbers or political enemies. The protection of tomb construction records required elaborate security measures that often rivaled those used to protect the tombs themselves. The ultimate irony of pharaonic tomb preparation was that the very measures designed to ensure eternal security often guaranteed that the pharaoh would become a target for grave robbers, political enemies, and ambitious successors who saw the tomb as a source of wealth, power, or revenge. The magnificent burial preparations that were supposed to demonstrate pharaonic power and ensure divine favor often became monuments to the futility of human attempts to control death in the afterlife. The pharaohs who spent their lives preparing for death discovered that death offered no escape from the political conflicts, family betrayals, and security threats that had defined their existence, as their tombs became new battlefields, where the struggles for power and survival continued long after their hearts had stopped beating. The death of a pharaoh was never simply the end of a life. It was a cosmic crisis that threatened to unravel the divine order of the universe, a political catastrophe that could destroy dynasties, and paradoxically, the beginning of a new phase of vulnerability, where even death offered no protection from enemies, grave robbers, and the relentless march of time that would eventually expose the darkest secrets of pharaonic rule. The elaborate funeral ceremonies that impressed foreign observers and awed Egyptian subjects were actually desperate attempts to maintain the illusion of divine power while managing succession crises, protecting burial treasures, and ensuring that the deceased pharaoh's enemies could not pursue their vengeance into the afterlife. The moment of royal death triggered a complex series of protocols designed to maintain political stability, while preparing for the elaborate burial ceremonies that could take months to complete. The death had to be announced carefully to prevent panic or succession disputes, while simultaneously being concealed from potential enemies who might take advantage of the kingdom's temporary vulnerability. Palace officials faced the delicate task of maintaining the fiction that the pharaoh was still alive and governing while secretly beginning the mummification process and succession procedures. This deception required careful coordination among trusted advisors who understood that revealing the truth prematurely could trigger civil war or foreign invasion. The mummification process itself was a 70-day ordeal that transformed the deceased pharaoh from a mortal corpse into a divine artifact suitable for eternal life. But this transformation required exposing the royal body to teams of embalmers, priests, and craftsmen who gained intimate knowledge of the pharaoh's physical condition, cause of death, and personal secrets that could be politically damaging. The embalmers who removed the pharaoh's organs discovered evidence of poisoning, violence, or disease that could reveal assassination attempts or disputed succession claims. Some pharaohs were found to have died from clearly unnatural causes, including multiple stab wounds, blunt force trauma, or obvious poisoning that contradicted official accounts of peaceful deaths. The case of Pharaoh Ramesses III provided a chilling example of how death could expose the violent realities of pharaonic life. When modern archaeologists examined his mummy using advanced scanning technology, they discovered that his throat had been cut so deeply that it nearly severed his head, revealing that the official account of his death from illness was a complete fabrication. The wound patterns suggested that he had been killed by multiple attackers in what was clearly a coordinated assassination, probably involving family members and court officials who had successfully concealed their crime for over 3,000 years. The discovery demonstrated that even the most carefully managed royal deaths could hide shocking truths about the violent nature of pharaonic succession. The burial treasure assemblage represented decades of accumulated wealth that had to be transported to the tomb while maintaining security against theft and protecting against sabotage by enemies who might seek to deny the pharaoh proper burial equipment for his afterlife journey. The logistics of moving thousands of precious objects from royal treasuries to burial chambers required military-style operations with armed escorts, secure transportation, and coordinated timing that created opportunities for robbery or attack. Some royal funerals were disrupted by grave robbers who attacked treasure convoys, while others were sabotaged by political enemies who stole or destroyed essential burial equipment. The funeral ceremonies themselves were elaborate, theatrical productions designed to demonstrate divine power and political continuity, while concealing the chaos and uncertainty that often surrounded royal deaths. The processions that carried royal mummies to their tombs were magnificent spectacles that involved thousands of participants, elaborate musical performances, and displays of wealth that impressed observers and reinforced the mythology of pharaonic power. But behind the ceremonial splendor, these processions were also security nightmares that required extensive planning to prevent assassination attempts against the new pharaoh, theft of burial treasures, or disruption by political opponent. The sealing of royal tombs marked the official end of pharaonic life. But it also began a new phase of vulnerability, as the sealed burial chambers became targets for grave robbers who possessed inside information about tomb layouts, treasure locations, and security systems. Many tomb robberies occurred within years or even months of royal burials, suggesting that the perpetrators included individuals who had participated in the burial ceremonies or tomb construction. The most devastating tomb robberies were inside jobs carried out by priests, guards, or officials who had legitimate access to burial sites and detailed knowledge of tomb security measures. The political implications of royal death often created succession crises that could last for years and involve multiple claimants to the throne, who used grave robbing, tomb desecration, and ritual destruction as weapons against their rivals. Competing pharaohs would sometimes order the destruction of their predecessors' burial sites, reasoning that denying proper afterlife arrangements would legitimize their own claims to divine authority. Some succession disputes involved elaborate tomb wars where rival factions attacked each other's burial sites, destroyed religious monuments, and defaced royal inscriptions in attempts to erase their enemies from history. The international ramifications of pharaonic death created opportunities for foreign enemies to exploit Egypt's temporary weakness during succession periods. Neighboring kingdoms often timed their invasions or diplomatic pressure to coincide with royal funeral periods when Egypt's attention and resources were focused on burial ceremonies rather than military defense. Some foreign rulers provided support to Egyptian succession claimants in exchange for future political concessions, creating international dimensions to domestic succession disputes that could persist for generations. The religious establishment often used royal deaths as opportunities to increase their own power and influence by claiming special authority over burial procedures, afterlife preparations, and succession legitimacy. Priests who controlled essential burial rituals could effectively veto succession claims by refusing to perform proper ceremonies for politically unacceptable candidates. The theological expertise required for proper royal burial gave priestly factions enormous leverage during succession crises, allowing them to extract political concessions or reshape government policies in exchange for their cooperation with new rulers. The grave robbing industry that flourished throughout Egyptian history was often organized and sophisticated, involving professional thieves who possessed detailed knowledge of tomb construction, treasure storage, and security systems. These criminal organizations included former tomb workers, corrupt priests, and royal officials who sold information about burial sites to criminal syndicates. The most successful grave robbers were those who had legitimate access to royal burial sites and could steal treasures gradually over extended periods without triggering security responses. The documentation of tomb robberies in ancient Egyptian legal records reveals the shocking scale and organization of grave robbing activities that targeted royal burial sites almost immediately after they were sealed. Court records describe elaborate criminal conspiracies involving dozens of participants who systematically looted royal tombs, melted down precious objects, and sold stolen treasures in international markets. Some grave robbing operations were so large and well organized that they resembled military campaigns, with coordinated attacks on multiple burial sites and sophisticated distribution networks for stolen goods. The discovery of royal mummies in modern times has revealed disturbing evidence of post-mortem violence against pharaohs whose enemies pursued them even into death. Some royal mummies show evidence of deliberate mutilation, dismemberment, or destruction that occurred after the initial burial, suggesting that grave robbers or political enemies returned to burial sites to inflict additional damage on deceased pharaohs. The systematic destruction of royal burial equipment, the theft of religious texts, and the deliberate defacement of tomb inscriptions demonstrated that pharaonic enemies understood the religious significance of proper burial and actively sought to deny their victims successful afterlife journeys. The psychological impact of constant awareness of post-mortem vulnerability affected pharaohs throughout their lifetimes, creating chronic anxiety about death that influenced their political decisions, religious practices, and personal relationships. Many pharaohs became obsessed with burial security, devoting enormous resources to tomb protection, while neglecting other governmental responsibilities. The knowledge that death would not end their vulnerability to enemies created a form of existential terror that affected royal mental health and contributed to the paranoid atmosphere that characterized pharaonic court life. The economic consequences of royal death often created financial crises that could destabilize the Egyptian kingdom for years after the pharaoh's burial. The enormous costs of funeral ceremonies, tomb construction, and burial treasure assemblage consumed significant portions of the royal treasury, while the political uncertainty surrounding succession often disrupted trade, tax collection, and military operations. Some kingdoms never fully recovered from the economic disruption caused by elaborate royal funerals, creating long-term weakness that made them vulnerable to foreign invasion or internal rebellion. The technological innovations developed for tomb security often failed to protect royal burials, as grave robbers quickly adapted to new protective measures and developed counter-technologies for defeating security systems. The elaborate trap mechanisms, hidden passages, and false chambers that pharaohs installed in their tombs provided only temporary protection against determined thieves who possessed inside knowledge and sophisticated tools. The archaeological evidence suggests that most royal tombs were robbed within centuries of their construction, despite the enormous resources devoted to their protection. The foreign archaeological expeditions that began excavating Egyptian tombs in the modern era revealed the ultimate failure of pharaonic attempts to achieve eternal security through elaborate burial preparations. The treasures that pharaohs had accumulated for their afterlife journeys ended up in foreign museums, private collections, and black market antiquities trades that scattered royal burial goods across the globe. The royal mummies that were supposed to rest eternally in their sacred tombs became tourist attractions, scientific specimens, and museum exhibits that exposed the most intimate aspects of pharaonic life and death to public scrutiny. The curse mythology that developed around Egyptian tombs represented a modern echo of ancient pharaonic attempts to protect their burial sites through supernatural intimidation. While the famous Curse of the Pharaohs was largely a creation of early 20th century popular culture, it reflected genuine ancient Egyptian beliefs about the spiritual dangers of disturbing royal burials. Some tomb inscriptions included explicit threats against grave robbers, while burial chambers contained protective spells and magical devices designed to destroy or punish intruders. The persistence of curse beliefs demonstrated the psychological power of pharaonic attempts to extend their authority beyond death. The scientific examination of royal mummies has revealed the shocking physical evidence of the violent and stressful lives that pharaohs actually lived behind their divine facades. Many royal mummies show evidence of malnutrition, chronic disease, battle wounds, and premature aging that contradicted the official propaganda about pharaonic health and divine protection. The medical analysis of royal remains has exposed assassination attempts, family violence, and health problems that were carefully concealed during the pharaoh's lifetimes but became obvious after death. The DNA analysis of royal mummies has revealed the complex family relationships and succession disputes that characterized pharaonic dynasties, including evidence of incest, illegitimate children, and disputed parentage that would have created enormous political problems during the pharaoh's lifetimes. The genetic evidence has confirmed that many pharaohs were related in ways that contradicted official genealogies, while others were clearly not biological descendants of their claimed predecessor. These discoveries have provided scientific confirmation of the family conflicts and succession disputes that ancient sources described but could not definitively prove. The conservation challenges facing royal mummies and tomb artifacts have demonstrated the ultimate futility of pharaonic attempts to achieve physical immortality through mummification and burial preparation. Despite the enormous resources devoted to preservation technologies, royal mummies continue to deteriorate due to environmental factors, handling damage, and the natural processes of decay that no ancient technology could permanently prevent. The irony is that pharaohs who spent their lives preparing for eternal preservation have become more vulnerable to destruction in modern times than they ever were during their lifetimes. The continuing discovery of royal tombs and burial sites has revealed that pharaonic burial practices evolved constantly in response to the persistent failure of previous security measures to protect royal remains and treasures. Each generation of pharaohs attempted to learn from their predecessors' failures by developing new tomb designs, security technologies, and burial procedures that would finally achieve the eternal protection that had eluded earlier rulers. The archaeological record demonstrates that these innovations were consistently defeated by grave robbers, political enemies, and natural processes that made true eternal security impossible to achieve. The modern tourist industry that has developed around ancient Egyptian burial sites represents the ultimate irony of pharaonic attempts to control their post-mortem fate. As the tombs that were designed to provide eternal privacy and security have become public attractions that expose the most intimate aspects of royal life and death to millions of visitors. The pharaohs who went to enormous lengths to conceal their burial locations and protect their remains from disturbance have become the subjects of constant public scrutiny, scientific examination, and commercial exploitation that would have horrified them during their lifetimes. The legacy of pharaonic burial practices extends far beyond ancient Egypt, influencing burial customs, religious beliefs, and cultural attitudes toward death throughout human history. The Egyptian obsession with death preparation, afterlife security, and eternal preservation has provided a model for subsequent civilizations, while also serving as a cautionary tale about the futility of human attempts to control death and achieve immortality through material means. The magnificent tombs and elaborate burial preparations that were supposed to ensure pharaonic eternal glory have instead become monuments to the universal human struggle against mortality and the inevitable failure of all earthly power to transcend the fundamental limitations of human existence. The pharaohs who had lived as gods ruled as divine beings and died as legends discovered in the end that death was the great equalizer that reduced all their earthly power to dust, their golden treasures to museum pieces, and their eternal ambitions to archaeological curiosities. The golden prisons that had confined them during life became literal tombs that could not protect them from the ultimate enemies of time, decay, and human memory that eventually claimed even the mightiest rulers of the ancient world.